Hello everybody, welcome back. We've been working on our At the Movies application, and we began the class this week by kind of reviewing where we left off. So it took a little while just to kind of figure out where we left things, and then we fired up the application to see how it was working, just to do a refresher on what was and what wasn't working. And we ended up backtracking through the book. We didn't go that far back in the chapter, but far enough back to realize that we had a couple of mistakes. And so my first goal here is to show you the things that I corrected since the last video. The first thing that I corrected was I went to the index CSHTML file and noticed that this line here was different than what was shown in the book. And what I did is I corrected it, and I added the correct attribute. And I think I had it pointing to a controller, like the list controller maybe, and that was totally not the right thing to do. So I adjusted it, and I put in a call to the Angular app at the movies, and then we're just calling in the view element here to display it. The other change that I made is I went into the details controller, and that was what was shown in the PDF that I just had on the screen, and I have these highlights in here. So for both, I think both the list controller and the details controller, this S is omitted from your instructions. And what I've done is I've added it into both and then tested the application to make sure it's working, and it is. So those are the two really important changes. And then just to demonstrate that the stuff is indeed working, I'm going to go back here and do a refresh and bring up the page. And you notice how I have the inspect panel up, and I have that up for a couple of reasons. Last year when we were doing this particular exercise, we were running into errors, and some of the students were helping me to troubleshoot things, and we had an error last year that I didn't have this year, which is I was calling the route file with the wrong name, the wrong JavaScript name, and then the JavaScript console, which is this tab here, was displaying file not found, which helped us to diagnose the problem. That's not happening this year. The other thing that I was doing is I was going to the network tab, and if you guys aren't familiar with this, whenever you refresh a page, it shows you how long it takes for stuff to load. Now the interesting thing is just because you hit reload doesn't mean it's actually pulling it from the server. But if you are here with the inspect panel and you right click the refresh button, you get these extra choices in here. And I had that in last year's videos too. So regular, just click the button gives you a normal reload. There are times when you have to do the control F5 or the hard reload, which forces all the files to reload from the server. And then sometimes you actually have to empty the cache and do a hard reload to get things to show up. Once I corrected the mistakes in the files, it didn't seem like I had to do a hard reload, I don't think, in order to get it to work. It just worked. But if you have a situation where you've been loading it a lot, trying to get it to work, it might not really be looking for a fresh copy. It's just probably using a cached version. So in that case, you might want to actually choose empty cache and hard reload to get the stuff to display. And hopefully you're at the point where the stuff is loading up like this for you. So when you even go to just the root of the application, so you're not even appending to the URL, the routing file that we developed in At the Movies, and I'm just going to review that really quick. So in At the Movies JS file, this one here, it will tell you that when we type list on the URL, it should load up the list page. If we type details plus a number, it shows up the details of whatever ID is associated with that movie. And if you don't put in a URL, it should redirect you to the list automatically. And if you look in the browser window, you'll notice that even though I went to the root URL, it did append automatically the route to the list file. If I go ahead and click on any of the movie's details, it should pull back the movie with the release date and the length of the movie, with the movie title, the date, and the length all being dynamic elements that are being added from the database. And hopefully this is working for you. And if not, don't forget to try the hard reload. The other thing that you should know is once the application is up and running, some of these files can be live edited, saved, and then will appear in your browser to work correctly, which I was just verifying. So anything really that's an HTML file or a JavaScript file, those are not compiled files on the backside of the application. So it is very possible to leave the server running, make your edits, save them, go back to the browser, refresh or hard refresh, and get the stuff to pop up. All right. So let's just assume now that everybody's good with that part of it and that we're all ready to move on to the next section. So the next section is going to be at the top of page 375, and this is where we're going to create a custom movie service. And they give you a little bit of an explanation as to why they're doing this here. It says that you can define custom controllers with Angulars and models, but you can also create custom directives, services, modules, and more. And I know from a couple of my former students who actually work with these technologies, they work both with Angular and React, that's like a really big component of what professional like Angular and React developers do, is they create a lot of these types of things that are custom to their application that they can use to kind of augment things. Then when it becomes kind of like this encapsulated thing, you can move it from project to project and do some pretty cool stuff. And then you can just call it by name whenever you need it, and then it just basically works. All right. It says, for this application, you might make use of a custom service that wraps the capabilities of the movie controller's web API so your controllers don't need to use HTTP directly. And that's kind of an interesting thought here. Why would we not want to use HTTP directly? Because you have to remember that HTTP is a stateless protocol, and that's really a big piece here. So what we do is we use programming languages, in this case JavaScript, to kind of simulate session state management, and that's kind of a powerful thing. So what they're trying to do here is set up this definition, and we are going to create a file called movieservice.js, and we will add all this code to it. Now the question becomes, where do we put the file? So let's think about where we would put this file relative to the structure that we've been using so far. So if you look at our application, where would you guys guess that we would put this file?
Scripts. In the scripts folder?
Yeah, under the client folder. That's correct, Javier. So we would throw it into this folder here. So they're not really good about explaining that. So that's one of the reasons why I posed the question, is to see if you guys are latching on to their pattern here. So if you're not in like the stream of consciousness of reading the book, and then you come back to it like we're doing, you kind of forget where things are. So let's go ahead and create that. Let's, on this scripts folder, let's give it a right click. Let's choose add. And then we're going to choose JavaScript file. We're going to name the file the same as it is on page 375, which is movieservice.js. So it's like this. Lowercase m, uppercase s, and then the .js. And that throw it right into that folder. You see it appear there. I'm now going to go back over to the book and grab the code and paste that in to the file. So the paste seemed to work pretty well. It's not flagging anything as having an error. And notice how this is actually another one of these, what we call anonymous functions. And notice that we are passing something into it, and what we're passing into it is the actual app itself, which is the At the Movies app, which is the At the Movies JavaScript file. I hope that kind of ties it all together for you. So by passing it in there, we pass with it as an object all of its features and capabilities. And then depending on what we're looking to do, it's allowing us to pull back whatever information we're looking for relative to whatever we're asking for. And they do this in kind of a number of different ways. But if you look at the file carefully, really what we're putting in here is, it's pretty intuitive to figure out. That's kind of my point. Okay, so if you start just reading through the code, not like freaking out to what it says. So we have first variable here. And I guess I should probably point out a technique. And perhaps you guys are aware of this technique already, so in which case I apologize that I'm telling you information you already know, but in some cases, maybe you slept through your JavaScript class or something, I don't know. I mean, it happens, or maybe it's been a few semesters, right? But this technique that they're showing here is kind of a cool one, and they're doing it all throughout this little JavaScript file, and they're doing it a lot. And you know what? You can do this in many languages, and since I've been learning Python lately, I've noticed that in Python, this is kind of a habit too. So what we're doing here in that highlight that I have is, you notice on the right side of the assignment statement, the equal sign, we have a function that is unnamed, right? We call that an anonymous function. And whenever you have an anonymous function, it just brute force runs. And then on the other side of the assignment statement, it says var get all. So hold on a second. So I'm not naming the function, I'm making it anonymous, but I'm storing it in a variable. Now this is kind of a little bit of a mind bender. So really what I'm telling you here is that you're actually setting up a function, you're storing it in memory. You see the difference between just naming a function? Because as soon as I store it in a variable, it's storing in memory as an object we can keep calling upon. Where otherwise, let's say if we use a traditional JavaScript approach, we would say function get all parentheses, and we would just type the name here and call it as we need it. But every time I use get all as a name, it really is that function, this anonymous function. So I would actually use calls that would relate to get all with parentheses, but it's the thing that's existing in memory now as opposed to existing as text in a file. Kind of weird, right? But the interesting aspect of it is it gives you some capabilities that you don't otherwise have. One of them is the thing that we see in jQuery quite a bit, which is this ability to start chaining things together. And if the output of what you're chaining together feeds logically to the higher level element, there's a hierarchy that is allowed to happen. And you can create, chained functions partially. But if you start to analyze this carefully, this movie service is really a function. Get all is a function. And what does get all do? It gets all the movies, okay? If you get by ID, it's just getting the movie with the ID. And see, this is why it's important to name things in ways that make sense. If you're doing the update, well, in this case, you're looking at a particular movie, and if you're updating it, what are you doing? You're changing some of its information, right? You're changing the title or the length or the year. You also have a create, so you can create one from scratch, and then a destroy. So really what we're doing here is we have all the basic CRUD functions. So this is create, retrieve, get by ID is retrieve really, update, and then destroy or delete. And then we have one generic one that allows you to get all of them. So you see how that, it's kind of weird, but it's all there. And notice that there's also a return statement here that's listed. And what's fascinating about this, and keep this in mind, whenever you hit a return statement, regardless of what block of code you're in, you're popped out of that code. So if there's subsequent statements that ask you to return below the return statement that you've hit, those are never going to be touched if you've hit the return statement inside of this. Now because of these are all function definitions, we're going to come in here and look at movie service dot, for example, I have get all highlighted, so we'd call it by saying movie service dot get all. It would do the return statement and we're out. If we just call movie service, it will do this. Okay, so you're going to say, so it does all of it? That should be your question, right? All right, so we'll see this in action, and then hopefully it'll make more sense as you see it in action. But what it really is doing is it's giving you the capability to do all those things. And I hope that makes sense. So what we're saying is, by returning any one of these particular items, you're really returning the function. and it's giving you the capability to do that. And maybe that was a little bit long-winded, but it is how the technology works. All right. The last thing that we have to do here is they want us to add to the @themovies file. So we have to go to @themovies.js, and they want us to add at the very bottom a call to this external mechanism. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to throw in this statement. We're going to say app constant, and we're going to put in movie API URL. And if you're wondering where I'm grabbing this from, this is top of page 376 in our main textbook. And then the URL that points to the right location. Now the book once again has a typo, so I'm typing in movie, that's what's in the book. However, what we really need to type, as you probably might guess, is movies, plural, to get it to load up correctly. And you see how the IntelliSense engine was picking up on the mistake already. You know, as soon as I was doing this, it wasn't liking it too much. Although now it seems to like it. Okay, whatever. So much for that. All right. I'm going to go ahead and save the @themovies file. I'm going to go ahead and save the movie service file. Save both. And then we need to go to the index view now. So if you have the index file open, great. I just might not be seeing it. There it is. And then I'm going to add a call to the HTML for the HTML file to the new movie service. So I'm just going to pull that link in, and I'm going to add it to the very bottom of the list of scripts. And then remember, folks, that the point is sometimes you do need to have these in a certain order, but always do the drag and drop in an environment like this, because if it types it incorrectly, why would you take the chance of typing it in wrong? Make sure you save this file, and make sure also that this section has been corrected. And once again, last week I had put this in incorrectly. I must have copied it from the list controller or something, but once I fixed that, it seemed like most of the problems went away. Now, we updated the index.cs HTML file, @themovies.js file, and movie service.js file. None of those are compiled files, right? We're not working with any C# code. We're just working with JavaScript at this point. And because of that, I did not stop the server from running. And that way, every time I want to check something, I don't have to wait that like 2 minutes or whatever it is for it to load up, which is another reason why developers really like this. Frankly, it's because you don't have to stop stuff from running. They're not compiled files. It should just load up. The only issue that we run into is the fact that it might be cached in the browser. All right? All right, so you see, it seems like things came up just fine, right? The movies came up just fine. And then if I go to any one of the movies and pull up details, that's seemingly working okay too. Now, they didn't ask us to check this yet. Okay, but here's my paranoid mind. And I wouldn't even call it paranoid. I guess it's more of experience. You know, I just want to make sure we didn't break anything in the process here, and then keep moving on, and then wondering where it broke. I know right now it's still good. See my thinking? Yeah, so that kind of lends back to, like, you know, your like troubleshooting steps and for whatever that's worth. All right, next thing that we need to do is we need to go to the list controller. So we're at the bottom of page 376, and it says you can then change the list controller to use movie services instead of HTTP. So that's kind of like the grand takeaway here. So back over to the list controller, and then there's going to be a little bit of an alteration in this code. So without bringing the source code over to the screen, I'm just going through and I'm checking it line by line. So the first line looks okay. The second line looks okay, with the exception of we're not pulling it in through HTTP. Now we're calling our new service movie service. So what are we not using? We're not using jQuery to do this. See the difference? Now we're not at the mercy of that library, we're at the mercy of our own. And then on the next line, this is where it gets a little weird. So I'm going to kind of make a little space and type in some stuff and delete some stuff, just so you know. So we're going to call movie service. And really what we're doing here is we're chaining things. Remember how I told you that one of the advantages of taking an unnamed function and putting it into a variable is the ability to chain it, which simulates what you do in jQuery. So it tells you a little bit about how jQuery works. And since we're using movie service, instead of HTTP, we're just basically really effectively replacing that statement with this. And then, just so you see like the point of it, really the command is this. And I am removing what's inside here. And we are not calling just get, but get all, because that's the name of the method here. Okay, so that's what we're calling. We're saying movie service dot get all. It just says a function within a function. That's all it's really effectively saying. All right. Now the book lists get all on a separate line like this. And a lot of programmers, when they're working with complicated like jQuery statements or JavaScript statements like this, where everything's like a named anonymous function or whatever, they'll often separate it on lines just so you can see each call, right? So this is the top level. This is basically calling the file. This is calling one of the methods. And then, of course, we're adding to it still another method. And then you should ask yourself, where the heck is this one coming from? Is really what you should be asking. And that is coming from the jQuery libraries. Isn't that interesting?
How would you know that?
Experience. That's a good question, because we don't have any or here's one way, because we don't have any functions that we've created called .success.
So then you should logically think it's got to be from one of those other.
It has to be, right? And in this case, I know it's from jQuery because we got it from jQuery to start with. So the initial call here was $HTTP. So you see and really what that is in jQuery, keep this in mind, is that is a selector in jQuery.
So with the question mark PHP.
Right, exactly. Exactly. All right. Now because it's chained, I don't need the $sign here, but that's where it does come from. All right. But notice that success is actually another anonymous function. So you could actually, you could cut. You're going down the rabbit hole here. Is really what it is, a little bit. But this part will functionally not change. The other thing to be careful of is to make sure that these other pieces are all named correctly. You shouldn't have to change any of the other pieces. But this should be all of the changes here. So we would do a Control-S to save this JavaScript file. Now if we're changing it in the list controller, we also need to change it in the details controller, because that one was working very much the same way. So let's go over to that file and make the same adjustment. So the first thing that we're going to do is inside the function call here on line 2, and I'm noticing a couple changes here. One is they're keeping route parameters in there, right? And they're appending to the end, so it must not like the other order. And then we're calling our own service right here, movie service. Line 3 is going to stay untouched. And then from there, we're going to be adjusting this statement one more time. So we're going to remove the HTTP. We're going to say movie service. And the name inside of movie service is get by ID, just like this. And all we're sending to it is the ID. Now this makes for a simplified function call because all the messy work is now happening here. So instead of like worrying about all the little detailed calls and gets and puts and whatever, we're just calling the function that does it, and it makes this much, much simpler. So that's got to have ID in it there, the details controller. The success function here, that doesn't change either. I'm also looking at the last two lines, and those seem to be in order, so that's fine. Let's do Control S to save. All right. Now, not that I don't trust that it works, so once again, right, we just edited JavaScript files. The server's still running. I can tell because I can see the stop and pause buttons here. So let's go back to the browser and reload everything. I'm going to go back to the root URL again. I'm just going to do that through the address bar. See, it seems to be loading. Actually seems to be loading faster. Do you guys notice that? And then let's click on any one of these. Uh-oh. Okay. We might have an issue here, okay? So now we have to figure out what that issue really is. Does anybody else getting the same effect? All right. So you see now it doesn't seem to be working, right? So it doesn't seem to be actually loading up the files the right way. So one might think, okay, well maybe you do need to do a clean and build or something like that. But we do know that these are just JavaScript files. So this just looks like the plain text of what exists in those other files. It doesn't seem like it's like angularizing them or whatever you might call it. And then, it doesn't seem like anything had a problem loading as far as I can tell. But if I go to the console, I am noticing that it says that there's an error. And it's got a problem with something Angular, so, well, clearly, because it's not working. But it says, unknown provider, movie API URL provider. And if you remember our code, we have a spot in here where we injected, and I forget where that was, right here. Movie API URL. We added that here. And notice how that is continuing. And then maybe you should start thinking, well, maybe that's why the book didn't tell us to check it yet, right? Okay, so I'm not freaking out at this point. That's kind of my thing. So we're just going to continue now. We're going to press forward. We're at the bottom of page 377. And we're going to move to the section called deleting movies. All right. So it says in that section, it says this. It says to delete a movie, you can provide a button on the list view for the user to click, and then that will give them that option. So let's go to the list HTML file, which for me right now looks like this, which explains why when we're in the detail view, we see those particular pieces showing up. The detail, well, that was the details view. Those are the three things in the details view, and this is what the list view looks like. But we are going to alter this now, and we are going to do some changes. So you have a choice. You could either just copy all the code from the book, if that's easier for you, or you want to go line by line and add it in. And I think I'm going to go with the line by line approach on purpose. So I'm going to add in real carefully all the changes. The repeat is still the same, movie and movies. The first table data cell is the same. The second one is not. So let's focus on that. So they start by adding a class to it. So let's do that. Let's add a class. And this one is BTN and BTN default. Now if you're wondering where this is pulling up from, these are pre-created classes that are part of the Angular library, or excuse me, the Bootstrap library, that are pre-styled. And whoever put this together clearly knew what those were. In terms of the rest of the anchor tag, the href, # details with movie ID, that's all fine. And then the plain text details is fine too. We do need to add a button inside of this table data cell. So I'm just going to use the HTML tag button. And I'm not sure how many of you know that's even a a tag. Some people don't even learn that one, which I think is a little strange. And then once again, it's going to get the button default class added to it. And then it's going to get an Angular directive. And notice, this is kind of neat. So you notice how, like, when I typed in the ng, how all of a sudden it's pulling up all the Angular tools automatically, and it's pulling them up from its own repositories, like JavaScript and CSS files. And we're looking for one called ng-click, which is just out of view here, but I'm just going to type it in. And then when you click the button, so instead of, think about this here, instead of triggering a JavaScript file or a PHP file or the default action for the form, we are now using an Angular JavaScript code, right, that's going to trigger the delete function in our service called delete. That's the only place where we've created that.
In the movie service.js?
Correct, in the movie service.js. And then I am going to put some text here so that there's some text on the button so we know what's going on. The button tag closed itself automatically, which is fine. And we closed our table data cell, closed our row, closed our table, closed our div. We should be good. Let's save it. And now if we're lucky, we should have a details button and a delete button. And I want to explain something here real carefully. You notice that with the first example here on line 6, that we're just providing an anchor tag. But we're styling it like a button because we're applying the button class to it. That tells you a little bit about how Angular is working. So that's going to create a button, or something that looks like a button, and then the button class, or the button itself, will be a button with the same classes, so the end result will end up that they'll look exactly the same. But you created them different ways. Is one right or wrong? Neither one is right or wrong, it's just showing you both approaches. That's the why. You know, their thinking is, let's show them that you can do both and save that. All right. Now we do have to make sure that we have that delete thing fully in place. And I want to come back to this services file now and start taking a look, because we are telling it to delete something, but we're not necessarily telling it how. I don't know if that makes any sense. Back in our list controller, right now, we have movie service, and this is what brings back the information and puts it up on the screen. But in order for delete to work correctly, we have to actually tell it to do the work that we're trying to assign to it. So the fact that the movie service is saying delete doesn't actually do any deleting. It's just setting up the mechanism to do the deleting. Kind of like, you know, creating a pathway. So really the work's going to happen back here in the list controller, where we're going to give it a scope that will allow it to happen, and that scope will be added right here on this level. So I'm just going to add a line here and drop in the code. And I want to make sure that it's nested correctly, because that can really throw you off here if it's not. So I'm trying to copy this from my PDF. And it's being a little resistant on text selecting right now. Okay, there we go. And if it doesn't cooperate soon, I'm going to be typing this all by hand, which I don't want to do. Yeah, that was a tricky selection in my external document there, but this is the method that we're bringing in. We also have one more little piece here, because what happens is once we have a successful iteration of this, it's then asking us to remove by ID. So this is providing scope, and then the actual heavy lifting of it all is going to happen external to that, which is in a separate function. And using that same approach that we've been seeing, where they name an anonymous function, we're going to add one outside here on this level. Like so. So once again, we're just naming a function that's anonymous, accepts the ID as a parameter, and then it will just basically loop through looking for the particular movie, and if it finds it, it removes it. And if you guys aren't familiar with your jQuery command, splice is a command that finds it in basically an array or an array list, removes it, and then slides the other pieces into place to fill the gap. That's what splice does. And then it breaks out, which terminates the method from running. Now I am getting...
And this is on 378?
This is on 378. I am noticing I have one error here though, so this one might be a little tricky to track down, because it looks like I have one extra parenthesis here. So I'm looking really carefully at my code now to try to figure out where the heck I left a comma out. Because you notice what the error said when I hovered? It said comma expected. You know, sometimes it's helpful to read those. I don't see how the comma is needed here, frankly, but hey, I'm not going to doubt them. You know, if it's finding something like that, you know, it's definitely problematic. So let's just check all of our code for correctness. So I'm just doing a full-on comparison now with page 378. Make sure everything is in place exactly as shown on that page. And then, you know, with most attention going to the spots where we made changes, obviously. I mean, that would seem to make sense to me. That seems okay too. And that seems okay too. Oh, I see. Okay. I think I found it. All right. So in the book, there is an extra closing curly bracket and semicolon here. Let's see if that fixes it. All right, now it's saying it's encountering a parsing error, and now it went away. You can notice how that went away? But now it says I have this, still have a red mark here. Let's do a Control S to save. And now I'm getting a different error here. And notice here it's saying expects equal, 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 as opposed to an equal, equal. Well, I'm going to go with what's in the book. That shouldn't stop the application from running. That's my thinking, at least. So I'm leaving it alone. I can see why I would try to enforce that, though. I mean, from a logical programming standpoint, you don't want to delete something that's not exactly the idea of what you're trying to delete. It would seem to be pretty logical. Once again, I'm going to go back. I'm going to hit a save all. I'm going to go back to the browser. And I'm not expecting any magic here. I'm just wanting to see like what's functional right now and what's not. Okay, so the list seems to be coming up. Let's see if we can see the buttons. Yeah, this is still throwing that same error. Let's try a hard reload on this. All right, so see how that fixed it? Right, the hard reload. Let's go back to the list. And really, we should be setting something different here too, shouldn't we? Remember the buttons we made? Yeah. Let's try the hard reload and see if that changes it. Isn't that interesting? Right. And
Oh, cool.
yeah, they're very cool. So it shows you the effect of that hard reload and what caching does to you. But because we are working with JavaScript files and not compiled code, it should adjust. Details should work. I'm not sure that delete's going to work, and at this point I'm not ready to try delete, frankly. I don't want to delete stuff from my database quite yet. Okay, so now we're moving on to the second half of page 379 called Editing and Creating Movies. All right. So let's go ahead and take a look at the HTML file that they're throwing at us now. So I'm trying to get this over onto our screen here. Now, all right, being able to see the details of something and being able to delete something, that's all well and good. But what about being able to edit something? Well, for that, we're going to actually need an edit controller to do that, and then an associated view to make it happen. So you can see here that they're going to include now an edit button, and actually they're calling it a create button, so they're thinking you're just going to add movies, and a bunch of code that goes with it. So that's our next task, folks. Now, the first thing that we want to do, and you see what I do often in my book is I see directions and I highlight them so I can see them in the future. It says create a new view called edit.html. So we're just going to follow the pattern that we've been using. So let's do that. So back over to Visual Studio. We're going to go to the Views folder under Client, right click, add an HTML page. This is going to be called edit.html. We are going to remove all the code inside of it and replace it with the code at the bottom of 379 and top of 380. So I'm going to do this in two pieces. Otherwise, we'll get artifacts from the copy paste. And I don't expect this to be the prettiest copy paste, but should work. All right, and then I'm going to do a Control A, right click, format selection, which just indents everything nicely. Just makes it easier to look at. All right, so let's take a look at what's going on here. So we are getting a form that's being generated. Notice another Angular command, ng-show, and it calls a thing called isEditable. We're going to have a field set and a few divs and labels and inputs. So we're going to have something for title, a label, and an input for it. Label and input for the release year and the length, and then we're going to have a save button and a cancel button. That's kind of like the whole layout. The other thing that I think is an important takeaway here is take a look at this special attribute called ngModel. So here's where the MVC stuff comes into play, folks. So they're pulling in the movie title, right? So they're pulling in the movie title to know which movie to edit. And see the chaining that happens here in the syntax, which is something that we're actually developing by the way that we're putting all our JavaScript files together. Right. We don't have some of this stuff created quite yet, but some of it we do. But you see the logic of it. It's really easy to read and figure out. All right, so make sure you Control S and save that one. And then let's move on. Now we need to actually alter our list controller to allow for the edit button. So kind of like the same thing that we did with delete, where we actually had to kind of like work with it a little bit, and I want to make sure that we're doing exactly the right thing. So we have the, and I'm not sure if they're doing this right here in the book. So I'm in the list controller JavaScript file, but apparently that's not where I want to be. So I'm thinking I need to be on the list HTML page, given the code they're showing in the book, and sure enough, that's where I am. All right, so this is the file we're working in then, is list.html. So the first part is the part that we already had and that we just adjusted. So this table row, so for each movie, it's putting up a delete and a details button. Okay.
Are you on page 380?
At the very bottom of 380. Very bottom of 380. Thank you for asking. All right. And what they want us to do here is actually put some buttons below the table. So I'm going to create a line there, and then I'm going to paste in this code. And I think they have a mistake here, or at least I kind of think they do, or maybe no, actually they don't. All right, so what I see in their code is they have a closing div here, and that's actually the close line 12. So that's actually like an empty div, so this should go back one level, really. And if you want, you can always do that trick I just did, select all, right click and format. That works great with HTML stuff. Kind of like what we did above, we created a button. We added the ng click thing to it, and then we're triggering a method called create. And then there's also this include here. This is kind of an interesting little statement. So it's going to take us to the edit document when we actually get there. But right now we're in the list document. So let's do a Control S to save that one. Okay, now we need to go back finally to that list controller, which is where I thought they would go next, but that's not how they proceeded. And then we're going to add an additional scope, as you might guess, for create. So I'm going to grab the code from the book, and where they're placing it is here. So sure, if that's where they want to place it, I'm all with it. So there's scope for create. Just make sure it looks exactly like that. And put it right above delete. And then I don't see that they're making any other changes here at all. Okay, and I'm just double checking. They're usually pretty good about highlighting the changed part, making it bold. All right, do a Control S to save. Make sure your work gets saved. All right, so now we want to go to the details view document, and they're making the point that if you're in the list view and you want to do an edit, great. What about if you're in the details view? Maybe you should add it here as well. So what they're doing is in this spot right down here is they're adding that capability. So basically the same, I think it's the exact same code. And I guess I'm going to verify that here. No, it's actually not the exact same code, is it? All right. Well, why don't I go ahead and just actually do this? And I see why now that I'm analyzing it. I'm going to actually type this in. That'll be the text on the button. And then we're going to have another div here. Which is going to pull in this page. because we're kind of layering it in here, the single quotes inside double quotes. And we don't have to put any text in there since the button will kind of name itself. All right, make sure you save that change as well. A couple more changes before we get to actually running this. We're real close to finishing. We're going to go back to the details controller now, and then add in the scope for edit like we did on the other thing. So this is going to go right above, actually right inside. This is going to go right after this and right above that. So we're going to put it here on line 9, and I'm going to paste this. And so it sets up the scope for edit in this spot. Control S to save. All right. Now, for those of you that are following along, and I'm hoping your brain thinks like this, because they did this one kind of backwards. They did all this work. They put stuff into the views. They thought about what they're going to do next. They added it to the other JavaScript files, but the one thing they didn't do is actually create the edit controller, which, for what we've learned so far, it almost seems backwards. But they're showing you that you can actually do it that way. It's not really a big deal. It doesn't break anything. We're working with JavaScript files, so they're a little bit more freeform. So we are going to come up to the scripts folder now, and we are going to create an edit controller. All right, so go ahead and click Add in Scripts, choose JavaScript file, and name it Edit Controller. All right, now you see that pop up there. Now with that file open, you can grab the code at the bottom of 382 and top of 383 and paste it in. So I'm going to drop that in first, and then get the rest of it. And then if you're doing a comparison, of course, you'll see that this is very, very similar to some of the other things that we've already done. But there's a little bit more that happens when you do an edit. That's kind of the point, because you're either creating it from scratch or you're changing what's already there. So there's more functions that go with it. I think they're pretty intuitive for the most part. Of course, back in our index file, since we're adding another script, we do have to bring that script into the list of scripts on the index page. You just drag and drop it right at the bottom, and that should be fine. The one thing that I'm noticing in their code is they're putting the movie service, and I don't know if you guys are catching like details like this, they're actually placing the movie service above the list controller, and I wonder if that's with intent. Now you could argue that, well, what does it matter if it loads into memory? It's there. You don't really, it doesn't really matter. You can just call it. Well, sometimes some JavaScript files do rely on other ones, and if they're giving an example where it seemed to have moved around on the list, I'm going to move it too. I do notice in the book on 383 though that their movie service has a capital M, and mine's got a lowercase m. Just to show you their inconsistency. So apparently they probably reworked it a couple of times too. All right, back in the index file down here, I'm also noticing a change, and I'm noticing that they're omitting this piece of it. Will that matter? It shouldn't, just so you know. So I'm leaving it alone. If I find that things aren't working, that's the first place I'm going to go look and make adjustments. All right, that's actually all the code for the chapter, folks. Let's go ahead, make sure that you do a save all, make sure all these files are saved, and then let's go back to the browser and bring up the page. So I'm going to go back to the root URL, and most likely with all of these pages, I'm probably going to do hard reloads just to make sure. I might also watch to see how stuff loads, but I think it reloaded because I didn't have a create button before, right? Right, okay. So that's good. Now I'm just going to start kind of walking through. Okay, I'm going to be brave here. This one doesn't seem to show the change, so I'm doing a hard reload. There's my edit button. Let's change something. Now here's the weird thing. Do I have to retype the title? Or is it just going to change the part I'm changing? Well, let's find out. So for length, I'm going to put in 122 minutes. And then I'm going to click Save. Okay. Let's do a refresh here. Do you notice? It did change. But I had to do a refresh to see it. So if I were to ramp up this application, I would force a refresh into the page automatically, but that's me. All right. Let's go back to the root. And let's try create. And I'm going to create a nonsense movie on purpose. This is 2019, and this is going to be 1 minute long, and I'm saving it. All right. Notice it did add it. Can I go look at the details? Yes. Right. Can I go back? Yes. Can I delete? Yes. So all those functions, all the basic CRUD operations are working. Now, I know as you look at this, you'll probably say to yourself, well, there's better ways to do all of this. Yes. I should probably have maybe a delete on the details page and maybe a create on the detail. Who knows? I mean, you can really kind of design it any way you want. The whole point is that at least we have the functional components working, and it shows you how it works. Now, this approach is kind of interesting. I want you to keep in mind that as we do this, we're steering the application with our URL. That's what Web API does. And we're using JavaScript files and HTML files to generate the content. However, we would call this a single page application, believe it or not, because we're not really necessarily reloading the page because we're running components that are pulled into the view. Right? And I hope that makes sense to you. This is a really common application development style right now, and Angular is not the only one that does it, but it's probably one of the more popular ones that does it. All right, that's going to end the tutorial for this one, so I'm going to stop the video here, and from here we're going to move into that Microsoft tutorial that we're going to do here collectively in class.
Can I ask you a question on this?